Have you ever noticed that the men who never explain themselves often leave the strongest impression? Strange, isn't it? In a world where everyone is constantly talking, defending themselves, and seeking approval, some men choose a different path. They say less, they reveal less, yet somehow they communicate more. The truth is, men who never explain themselves are often saying a lot about who they are without speaking at all. And once you understand why, you'll never look at confidence, respect, or silence the same way again. Before we begin, if you're a man who wants to become stronger, wiser, and more confident in today's world, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We share powerful insights on masculinity, psychology, and personal growth every week. And we're currently working toward our goal of reaching 1,000 subscribers, so your support would mean a lot. Now let's get started. Topic 1. Why most men feel the need to explain themselves. There's a reason so many men feel the need to explain every decision they make. When a man changes careers, ends a relationship, turns down an invitation, or chooses a path that others didn't expect, an invisible pressure almost always shows up. It's as if society is saying, sure, you can do that, but first convince us you're right. Without even realizing it, many men spend years chasing approval that was never theirs to earn in the first place. What's interesting is that this need rarely comes from confidence. Most of the time, it comes from fear. Fear of being misunderstood, fear of disappointing someone, fear of being seen as selfish, arrogant, or insensitive. A man decides to work late building his business and suddenly feels like he has to explain why he's never around. Another chooses to stay single for a while and feels pressured to justify that decision to friends and family. Little by little, life stops being guided by conviction and starts being guided by other people's reactions. Many men believe that if they can just find the right words, everyone will finally understand them. But experience tends to teach a different lesson. No matter how detailed the explanation is, there will always be someone who disagrees, criticizes, or filters everything through their own beliefs. And that's where an interesting question comes up. If explanations don't always create understanding, why do some men seem completely comfortable staying silent when they're being judged? Topic 2. Silence is often misunderstood. It's interesting how silence tends to make people uncomfortable. When a man doesn't explain himself, doesn't defend himself, and doesn't rush to correct every misunderstanding, people immediately start filling in the blanks with their own assumptions. Some assume he's arrogant, others think he's cold, distant, or simply doesn't care. But in reality, silence rarely reveals what people think it does. More often than not, it says far more about the person interpreting it than the person remaining quiet. Think about how many times someone has tried to pull an explanation out of a man that didn't really need to be given. A man decides to leave a stable job to pursue something bigger. Suddenly, the questions start rolling in. Are you sure about that? Don't you think that's risky? Why would you do that? Strangely enough, the more he tries to justify himself, the more questions appear. But when he stays calm and confident without feeling the need to convince anyone, something shifts. Not everyone understands it, but many people start respecting it. There's a psychological reason for that. People have become used to living in a world where everyone explains everything all the time. Social media, endless debates, comment sections, and constant opinions have created the expectation that every choice should come with a public defense. So when people meet someone who doesn't feel that need, it seems unusual. And that's where a major difference begins to emerge between men who seek approval and men who possess something much harder to build, confidence that doesn't depend on other people's agreement. Topic 3. Men who know who they are rarely defend themselves. There's a huge difference between a man who's trying to prove who he is and a man who already knows who he is. The first spends a large part of his life defending his choices, his opinions, and even his worth. The second doesn't feel the need. Not because he thinks he's better than anyone else, but because his identity isn't tied to outside approval. When someone questions his decisions, he listens, considers the perspective, and moves on. After all, a tree doesn't stop growing just because someone doubts the strength of its roots. Men who have developed clarity about their values Understand something many people only learn after years of frustration. Not every criticism deserves a response. Imagine a man who has decided to prioritize his health, his business, or his peace of mind. Some people will support him, others will call him selfish. If he spends his time trying to convince every person that he's doing the right thing, he'll end up spending more energy explaining his life than actually living it. And the more he defends himself, the more power he hands over to others to define who he is. Perhaps the most fascinating part is that real confidence is usually quiet. Performative confidence needs applause, recognition, and constant validation. Genuine confidence works differently. It shows up when a man stays grounded even when nobody approves, when he keeps moving forward despite being misunderstood. And that ability to stay centered in the face of outside opinions creates room for something even rarer: mastery over his own emotions, especially when life starts testing his limits. Topic 4. The hidden strength behind emotional control. When people talk about masculine strength, they often picture physical power, status, or financial success. But one of the most impressive forms of strength is almost invisible. It shows up when a man can control his emotions without being controlled by them. That doesn't mean pretending he feels nothing. It doesn't mean bottling everything up until he eventually explodes. It means recognizing what he's feeling and still choosing his response consciously instead of reacting on impulse. Think about how many conflicts could be avoided if more men mastered this skill. A provocative comment at work, an unfair criticism at home, or an argument online can easily turn an ordinary day into a completely unnecessary battle. Emotionally mature men understand that not every provocation deserves attention. They don't confuse reacting with strength. In fact, sometimes the greatest display of power is simply staying calm while everyone else loses control. It's like holding the steering wheel steady during a storm instead of yanking it in every direction. Over time, this kind of self-control produces something incredibly valuable: freedom. A man who isn't a slave to anger, approval, or other people's opinions starts making smarter decisions. He stops acting to impress others and starts acting according to his principles. Interestingly, that's when something unexpected happens. The less he feels the need to react or justify himself, the more people start paying attention. And that reveals a fascinating paradox about human behavior. Very often, the more someone explains their actions, the less convincing they seem. Topic 5. The more you explain, the more people question you. There's a fascinating paradox in human behavior. The more someone tries to justify their choices, the more they seem to invite judgment from others. That's because excessive explanations often send an invisible message. Without realizing it, a man who spends several minutes defending a decision can come across as someone who isn't fully convinced by his own choice. It's like watching a salesperson push a product a little too hard. At some point, people start wondering what might be hiding behind all those words. Imagine two men making exactly the same decision. The first responds to criticism with long explanations, trying to convince everyone that he's right. The second simply says, "It was the best decision for me at this point in my life," and moves on. Interestingly, the second man usually appears more confident, even though he says much less. That's because confidence isn't communicated only through words. It's communicated through the calmness with which someone stands by their choices. And few things project confidence more clearly than refusing to turn every decision into a public debate. That doesn't mean a man should never explain his intentions. In healthy relationships, at work, and in important situations, communication still matters. The difference lies in the motivation behind it. Explaining something to create understanding is one thing. Explaining something because you're looking for validation is something entirely different. And once a man learns that distinction, people begin reacting to him differently. Some start respecting him more. Others become visibly uncomfortable. And that discomfort reveals a psychological dynamic that most people never stop to notice. Why silence makes some people uncomfortable. One of the most interesting things about silence is that it often works like a mirror. When a man refuses to engage in unnecessary arguments or justify every choice he makes, some people simply accept it and move on. Others, however, become restless. They keep asking questions, push for answers, or try to provoke a reaction. At first glance, it may seem like they're trying to understand him, but many times, what they're really trying to understand are the feelings his silence has triggered within themselves. That's because silence creates space for interpretation. And when there aren't enough explanations to fill that space, people tend to fill it with their own insecurities. Someone who constantly seeks validation may struggle to understand a man who doesn't seem to need it. Someone who worries endlessly about what others think may find it difficult to comprehend a man who follows his own path without asking for permission. That's why emotionally independent men often provoke strong reactions. Not because they're doing anything extraordinary, but because they're demonstrating a completely different way of living. Perhaps the most important lesson is understanding that not every discomfort needs to be resolved. Many men spend years trying to manage other people's emotions, repeatedly explaining themselves to avoid criticism or disappointment. But eventually, maturity requires a different approach. Not every opinion needs to be corrected. Not every misunderstanding needs to be controlled. And when a man finally accepts that truth, he discovers something even deeper. Staying silent is not the same thing as creating a mysterious image. In fact, there's a huge difference between appearing mysterious and simply being authentic. Topic 7. The difference between mystery and authenticity. After realizing the power of not constantly explaining himself, some men fall into an interesting trap. They begin to believe they need to appear mysterious. They talk less, hide their thoughts, act distant, and create an aura of being hard to reach. But there's a massive difference between being private and creating a character. A truly confident man isn't trying to seem interesting. He's simply busy living according to his values, without feeling the need to turn his personality into a strategy. That's because authenticity and mystery are not the same thing. Forced mystery requires constant effort. A man has to carefully calculate his words, manage his image, and think about how others perceive him. Authenticity works in the opposite way. It creates ease. An authentic man speaks when he believes something needs to be said, stays silent when he sees no reason to speak, and doesn't make those choices based on the impact they might have. Ironically, that's exactly what earns respect. People can sense when someone is performing a role, and they can also sense when someone is completely comfortable being who they truly are. Maybe that's why the most admired men rarely seem concerned with looking strong, mysterious, or impressive. They simply live with consistency. Their words match their actions. Their principles remain steady even when nobody is watching. And that quiet consistency communicates something far more powerful than any speech ever could. Because in the end, when a man stops worrying about the image he's projecting, he starts revealing something much more important: what his silence is actually saying about who he is. Topic 8. What a man's silence really says about him. At the end of the day, a man's silence doesn't always mean what people assume it means. Most of the time, he's not trying to be mysterious, indifferent, or difficult to understand. He's simply reached a point in life where he no longer feels the need to ask for permission to be who he is. He has learned that his peace is worth more than endless arguments, and that not every opinion deserves space in his mind. This mindset doesn't come from arrogance. It comes from clarity. And clarity is something very few men develop without facing challenges, making mistakes, and enduring their share of disappointments. When a man stops constantly explaining himself, he sends a silent message to the world. He demonstrates that he knows his values, has taken responsibility for his choices, and is willing to live with the consequences of those choices. That doesn't mean he never listens to advice or believes he's always right. It simply means his identity is no longer in the hands of other people's approval. He understands that some people will understand him and some won't. And he's at peace with that reality. There's incredible freedom in no longer trying to control how other people see you. Perhaps this is one of the strongest signs of masculine maturity. Not the ability to win arguments, not the ability to impress people, but the ability to remain loyal to your principles, even when nobody is applauding. A man who learns this discovers something powerful. The less energy he spends trying to prove who he is, the more energy he has to become who he wants to be. And in many ways, that's exactly where his real transformation begins. Conclusion. The next time you feel the urge to explain yourself, pause for a moment and ask yourself a simple question. Am I explaining to create understanding, or am I explaining because I need approval? That single question can change the way you move through life. Because the strongest men aren't the ones who win every argument. They're the ones who know who they are, even when others don't understand them. So think about this. How much of your energy is spent managing other people's opinions? How many decisions have you delayed because you were worried about being judged? And what could happen if you finally stopped asking for permission to live according to your own values? Leave a comment below and tell us, do you think people explain themselves too much these days? Or is silence becoming a lost skill? If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss future content about masculinity, confidence, psychology, and personal growth. And if you'd like to help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers, your support would truly mean a lot. We'll see you in the next video.